In this episode, I visit with Gordon Firemark. Gordon is the podcast lawyer, and we talk about some of the current legal issues around podcasting, Chat GPT in podcasting, and the new announcement by Facebook that's going to enter the podcast realm. I know you'll enjoy this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and today I have with me and someone who I only can say this about, my lawyer, Gordon Firemark. Gordon is also the podcast lawyer, which is why he's my lawyer. So, Gordon, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Tom, it's great to be with you again. Once more into the breach, as they say.
Once more into the breach, dear friends. Indeed. And that breach is, I just like to have an annual checkup with you about what's going on in the world of podcasting from your legal perspective. And I know you do a lot of representation, have done a lot of work in the entertainment industry, and you see and have seen podcasts evolve over the years, and you've shared that with us before. But what did you see in 2022 in terms of evolution, and where it may be going in 2023?
Wow. Well, 2022 really was sort of the year of the defamation cases. There were a lot of defamation claims brought by, people talked about on podcasts, usually, fairly high profile people who were the subject of a controversial conversation or something like that, suing a host. And, most of these cases end up being settled. So we don't really hear much other than the initial headline, someone suing someone. What else? There've been, well, obviously, what's come up, there've been some voice clone kinds of claims, actually more about clips from podcasts being used there was one that was a television ad for a hockey team. One of the fan podcasts, they grabbed a bunch of clips from the show and used it in their commercials and things like that. So that's a little crazy. What else? Trademark name, brand names, titles. Oprah suing the producers of a show they called Oprah-demics. And she's suing them over the trademark infringement included in that. What else? Yeah, well, it's a big variety. It's more of the same every year. the usual suspects: copyrights, trademarks, music, libel, privacy, that kind of stuff.
Gordon, we met, I think, in 2015 at Podcast Movement, and you gave a talk on sort of the legal aspects of running a podcast, being a podcaster, having guests, being a host, etc. And many of the topics you discussed in response, it was a largely non-lawyer audience, so you got a lot of non-lawyer questions. As your talks have evolved over the years, I hear you still talk about some of the basics, but evolutions into podcast networks. What does it mean when podcasters get together, and more sort of business entity aspects? Would that be a fair sort of recitation of the evolution of your talks, or are you still just talking about the basics?
I try to do both. I try to provide the 101 level stuff for the creators because I feel like they need the education, they need the information. But my practice depends on having clients who can actually pay for legal services. So working with networks, platforms, and production companies is good for my business. And so I try to also provide that level 200 and 300 level of information as well for those folks. So depending on the conference and frankly, depending on what the conference asks me to speak about. But we still have lots of newcomers into this field who don't understand copyrights, don't understand trademarks, and how to protect their own content and respect the content of others and those kinds of things. So I'm really trying to inform and educate on that end, and attract and work with folks a little more advanced level.
Are you seeing more interest in the media community, particularly centered in your part of the world, Los Angeles area, in content creators and other stories or other media created via the podcast format for exploitation in other forms of media, whether it be TV show or print?
There is a lot of cross media pollination going on, I guess you could say. TV and film producers are finding inspiration in podcasts that they're listening to. Podcasts are also, being inspired and driven by things that they see in the what I'll call the old mainstream media. I think podcasting is joining the mainstream pretty quickly here. And yeah, a lot of deal flow in both directions these days.
So at the last conference we both jointly attended was Podfest Expo 2023. And one of the early people who I met at that conference was Glenn the Geek, who has the Horse Doctor podcast and associated other podcasts. And he was able to sell his entire network to a larger media outlet who saw value in what he was doing. Also, within the podcast format, they didn't have as much of. Are you starting to see those types of transactions as well?
Well, Glenn's an interesting case study because he built up a very successful network around a particular niche of shows, horses, and like golf and like some other hobbyist kinds of activities, people will spend inordinate amounts of money on products and services for their horses and those kinds of things. And so he had a sponsorship base and all that. It made it a very attractive acquisition target. And congratulations to Glenn, living the dream, sell the network and continue working for it, but on your own terms. There's a bit of that going on. We had a glut of that I want to say 2017, 2018, when Spotify started buying up podcast networks, but that was a little different, and the attitude about it was a little different because it looked like Spotify was trying to bring everything into its silo and get away from the open format stuff. Right now, we're seeing a bit of a recession in the podcasting space as well, and so companies are not spending the kind of money that they were even just a year or two ago to acquire new content, especially networks. But advertisers are still doing their thing, and I think it's still bullish for the network business right now.
So you're absolutely right. Glenn was a leader in many ways. He's been doing podcasting for, I think, 12 to 15 years, an early adopter of the network, and now the early adopter of cashing out at a very attractive fee
Right.
As well. So we've all looked up to him, and I certainly have, and I'm going to continue to look up to him for inspiration on that part. Let's check in a little bit about what you've got going, and in terms of your law practice. Could you remind the audience again about your practice and what you do?
Well, I am a almost full service entertainment law solo practice attorney. I do work in the film, television, and live theater industries as well as digital media. But the last few years, I've been spending a lot of my energy and enjoying working with digital creators in the podcasting, blogging, and the YouTube video kind of space as well. And I help them with all kinds of structural, entity formations, intellectual property protection, intellectual property licensing, content related stuff, and strategy for monetization and those kinds of things. So I'm really a deal maker, but I do what the Hollywood industry calls the business affairs department kind of work.
At one point, you were teaching as well. Has that continued for you, or where's that part of your genre?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I love the sound of my own voice, which is why I podcast and do other things too. And part of that, and also it's a kind of giving back. As I said earlier, I really want to make sure that newcomers into these industries have the information they need to operate safely and be protected. So yeah, I do some teaching. I have a couple of classes this semester at Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandise here in Los Angeles. I teach a course on intellectual property sort of basics, and we have a lot of fun with that. And we actually do a mock trial in the class, which is just a hoot. The kids really love that. This is undergrads. And then I also have a little more advanced class on media ethics and law in the digital space, and really, really enjoying the thoughtful discussions from 21-year-olds and how they approach things. And being an old white guy, it's a very different world than what I grew up with. So
You also utilize social media as well as any other lawyer I've seen. So could you tell us about some of the Gordon Firemark law firm social media offerings, starting with your podcast, but also about your sort of weekly office hours and your
yeah.
different courses, and really a great potpourri of different ideas that you put out there.
Well, I am a geek is what it comes down to, and I love to play with these new technologies, and I love to put myself out there and be interacting with the world. So yes, I have my podcast. My main show is called Entertainment Law Update. It is aimed mainly at entertainment law practitioners. We do sort of um, a monthly legal roundup of case briefing of the various cases that have happened that are of interest in the arena. I also do a show much more targeted for the podcasting and digital media creator community called Legit Podcast Pro. It is a live stream that I do video and audio, and then also publish it as a podcast. You can find it on YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and Twitch. And, I said I'm a geek, right? So that's a lot of fun. And each week I cover in about a 10-minute segment an issue of some sort that is relating to the digital creation community. And that's a lot of fun for me. I blog, and my website at firemark.com is a place to find that stuff. And courses. Yeah. One of my other approaches to providing the material and information is I've got some online courses and template documents and things like that all available on my website over at gordonfiremark.com.
There have been a couple of interesting, very recent developments in the podcasting world. One's a little bit broader than the podcasting world, and that's Chat GPT.
Yeah.
And I know you've started to research that and look at that from the podcasting angle. So what sort of questions are you getting, or what sort of advice are you giving now at this point around Chat GPT?
Well, yeah, it's not just ChatGPT, but the AI in general has become it's a hot button issue here in the first quarter of 2023 when we're recording this. There are a number of issues around it. There's the copyright questions relating to how the training material for these tools, whether it's a visual art tool or audio or text-based stuff, how that's been ingested, from scouring the internet for years. These systems developed, and there are some questions about whether or not they're infringing on copyright or whether there's fair use. Is it transformative? These are the kinds of issues that we copyright lawyers are thinking about all the time. But also, there's been some issues about if you're using these tools to create your content, can you claim ownership of the content? Because the Copyright Office has just recently made another ruling saying that in order to be an author for purposes of copyright ownership, you have to be human. So the machines can't create copyrightable material, which means I use a chat GPT to do something and put it out there, and someone else wants to copy it, they're free to do so. More importantly, though, these tools have all kinds of potential nefarious uses, the deep fakes, the substituting voice cloning kinds of things where you make it sound like someone said XYZ when in fact you just typed it into a machine and out it came in their voice. So possible defamation case kinds of things, and of course the voice talent who are in the voice talent business, who act for a living on microphones. They're very worried that they're going to be put out of jobs. So there's awful lot going on right now around the AI stuff.
So I found Chat GPT. The first time I used it, I thought, or I felt like it was when I was 7 and my parents bought Encyclopedia Britannica for our first encyclopedia. I thought, this is exactly what Chat GPT is. And when we got an encyclopedia, I was reading it every night just because I'm that same kind of geek.
Yeah.
And so what I have seen is it's not really given me a better or more efficient business process. It's really given me access to more information. Has your experience been similar to that or something different?
Well, my experience, yeah, it has been a little different. I've actually used it, and by the way, I think it is a fantastic tool. These are, amazing technologies. However, we have to be really careful because, for example, I asked it to write my own Wikipedia entry, and it got almost everything wrong. So it can't entirely be trusted to give you the right information. If you're using these tools to create content, I think it becomes even more important that we do the right fact checking and verify things. And it's not just about the sniff test. We really have to dive deep into where's this information coming from. That also raises the question of copyright infringement when the the bot might actually be using an entire passage from somebody else's blog post or something like that it found. And so we've got those concerns. I will say it's great for creating outlines of topics. And if you structure a query correctly, you can get a really terrific 5 or 10 point outline of, you know, talking points about a particular subject. And so that can streamline podcasting quite a bit. You still have to, I think you still have to bring your own originality to it, but the tool's getting better and better. I think it's not long before we can trust it more. And I think people are already trusting it, probably ill-advisedly. But
So I have started yet a third network
hmm,
called the Texas Podcast Network. And I decided that I would use Chat GPT as my business resource. And number one, you're absolutely right. If you refine your query well enough, you can get a pretty good outline of what you need to do to run a podcast network. But it also struck me as I might be able to write my own case study to see how this can be used. So I'm experimenting with that as I move forward in that arena. We also had another announcement this past week, which I wanted to ask you about, which is not on the outline, and that's YouTube going to some sort of podcasting. And I have to say, I've been posting podcasts on YouTube since 2012.
mhm.
And so to me, it's always been a place for podcasts. Is their announcement something different, or have you started fielding queries from your clients or potential clients around this new YouTube initiative?
Well, I haven't exactly been fielding queries about it. I think everybody's figuring this stuff out for themselves for the most part, and it doesn't really implicate a lot of legal issues. What I will say about it is, what's new is that they are actually designating certain playlists or channels as podcasts, and I think that they are going to be, maybe they already are, creating RSS feeds that your players can use to listen to those YouTube or watch those YouTube streams sort of as podcasts in a podcast app. They've also announced that um, their app is going to now allow for the screen of the device to be off while continuing to play the audio. So you can actually, put it on in the car and not get in trouble with the law for driving while watching videos, and still get your content that way. I think it's pretty exciting. It is the second largest search engine in the world, and that means that discoverability for podcasts is going to be great. And of course, it's owned by Google, which is the first largest search engine in the world. So good news there too. The one thing I will say as a caveat is I don't think we should be relying on it as a place to put all of our content first. I think it's still, we need to let it evolve a little bit, because Google has notoriously over the years tried things, thrown it against the wall, and a couple of years goes by, and if it sticks, great, and if not, not. YouTube's been around a long time, but some of us are old enough to remember Google Plus and even Google Podcasts, things like that. So I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket right now.
Gordon, we're both attending Podcast
Yeah.
Movement Evolutions next week in Las Vegas. I know you're speaking. Could you give us just a teaser of your presentation?
Well, I and my colleague Merlin Jean-Louis are presenting just sort of a Legal Eagles view from the top, kind of a panel, just looking at the core issues in podcasting right now. And I've been working on the outline and expecting to, again, this is sort of that 101 level education for podcasters. And Evolutions is a little bit of a more advanced group, so I think we'll get a little more into the weeds on a few things. But yeah, still focusing on giving the basics.
Gordon, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself, your law firm, or really any of the topics we've touched on, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Well, the best thing to do is to use my name, GordonFiremark.com. Will get you to, sort of the hub website that'll point you in the direction of other things. And Entertainment Law Update is the main podcast. Also, Legit Podcast Pro. If you search for that, you'll find me on YouTube and things like that. And G Firemark on most social media will find me.
And I will just attest that Gordon has a ton of resources on his website. He is one of the best resources if you're a podcaster from the legal perspective. As I said, he's my lawyer. He's the guy I recommend. And if you need any help from the podcast or broader entertainment world, I would suggest you contact Gordon through his firm website. So, Gordon, I look forward to seeing you at Podcast Movement Evolutions. And as always, thanks again for taking the time to visit with me.
Thank you. It's always great, Tom. See you next week.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, the longest running podcast in compliance. I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.